let's start with how you got into art from architecture.
First, I studied fine arts. Then I went to architecture school. The decision to study architecture was pretty driven by economics.
Right.
But ultimately, I think that I couldn't be making this work without that background. I was making these sculptures that had mirror fronts to them, and I started making photos of the sculptures just to put in my portfolio. This guy who I knew was like, well, the photos are actually really interesting. Maybe you should think about that. And I was like, So I started understanding space through photography as an architect, which is kind of perverse. There's an object, there's a thing or a space, and then there's this other layer of the camera. What does that give us, and how do we manipulate that in order to think about space? The thing that I love and continue to love about Renaissance painting is not only color relationships, but just that the space has no requirement to work whatsoever. It's a giant kind of visual puzzle that never gets resolved, and there's no expectation it'll be resolved, so I love that. Natural disasters was, again, this idea that I wanted to make images that looked photoshopped without Photoshop, if that makes sense. And so I wanted almost this misreading. You look at this and you have already in your brain as a 21st century person this idea of Photoshop as a kind of filter through which you see images. Pretty much everybody's like, oh, that's just Photoshopped. No. Like this is a piece of paper that's taped onto a mirror, but you're getting the inside of it too. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. And that's what I like about your work a lot also, is that you can never tell the sizing of everything and the height of the actual objects that you photograph.
Yeah, and that's something that I feel interested in sort of generally, is this idea of scale and losing a night, you know, how people read scale. And so I wanted to do something that was just like a really pared down set of tools and set of circumstance. So the idea was just a corner and a piece of plexiglass. And so what could I do with that? The idea of sort of things as they are as the title is just like, what is this object and what's it capable of doing? I guess what I'm looking for in all of these is a kind of moment of misreading. I don't know, I just sort of enjoy that it's not all there for you, and there's maybe a layer that you have to unpack a little bit, and maybe, hopefully, never get to a resolution.
Do you have an idea of what the final product will look like?
Never.
You just experiment?
Never. Yeah, it's all just experimentation.
Your references of painting heavy.
Yes, always, yeah. The language that I'm interested in is the language of painting, but I oddly, for reasons I can't quite identify, have no interest in painting. So I am more interested in discovering relationships, which I think relates back to the architecture background. So I like putting two things together and trying to understand how they could be in relationship with each other, much more so than like as a painter inventing that relationship. I don't care about that. And I think as an architect, I just love things in the world. Like I love the walk to the studio and looking at facades and thinking about like, how is that made? And all of that stuff feels like, wow. Basically for me, the built work pieces, I wanted to think about just opacity and shade and shadow. So in some ways, that even though there are a lot of pieces to work with, I felt like the set of issues was really compressed, right? So I literally just had shade and, you know, the shadow and then the colors of the things themselves, and that was it, right? And so I lost the kind of reflectivity and sense of transparency or translucency. And I wanted to find in each of these this moment of just not knowing what you're looking at, maybe. And maybe to sort of dismantle this idea that you're reading it as a still life, but maybe it has some other stuff going on as well. Just trying to almost like use that as a way of maybe undermining how a still life works. That those spatial relationships are maybe a little more complex, and it's just hard to decipher.
But I feel like for these now, you're letting the viewer be their own lens.
Even people who have been here looking at these for a while haven't understood how they work. Yeah. So, I mean, they're very straightforward, but something weird is going on.
Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, thank you. Such a pleasure. Thanks all for coming.